Good morning. As this is my first ETT, I feel compelled to offer a bit of an ode to Jerry. So in full disclosure, I do not have an ocean-going vessel. I do have, however, a beautiful 16.5-foot Nahani Langford canoe, Kevlar.
That's where I started.
Cedar and ash, right? It's most of the time powered by two 1-horsepower engines, and it hits a speed of something that probably does not warrant the S in knots. I'd like to talk to you this morning a little bit about a technology that exists in the commercial space that we're seeing enter into the embedded space. It's here now, you're using it, and you probably don't know about it, and the embedded world that we live in has got to wake up to this technology, especially on the software side. And to talk a little bit about what this is, it's called hybrid core processors. And I'd like to start to see, by taking a bit of a poll, and hopefully the coffee has kicked in. I was taught at a young age not to assume. So I'm going to ask everyone to raise their hand if they use a laptop or a desktop computer. It doesn't matter if it's a PC, Mac. If you use a computer, let me see your hand up. And hold it up for a second. Just about everybody. So keep your hands up. If you know what kind of processor is in your computer, how many cores it has, what type of cores it has, how many threads it can run, keep your hand up. But if you don't know or you don't care, put your hands down. I see a small number, maybe 5, 6 people. Okay, thank you. That illustrates some of the points I'm going to make today. Same is true about your phone. 90% of you are running a phone today that has a hybrid core processor. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means, why they are very, very popular, especially in embedded systems, and how over the next year you'll start seeing some of these embedded hybrid core processors coming into our industry. Where it becomes very important is more of the embedded systems that we're seeing, whether it's an embedded, a connected kitchen with your toaster, believe it or not. Your toaster can be connected. Fridges, stoves, you can see what my stove is doing right here. I can turn it on, preheat it. Whether you have a car that has 10 or 20 processors, or the average car today is getting somewhere close to 100 processors on board. All of those processors are embedded. So it's not just the Vita world that we live in, the defense and aerospace industry, but everything that's embedded now has processors, and all of those processors require power. In the consumer world, it does not really matter whether your save of a file takes 2 or 3 seconds or 5 seconds. But in the embedded world, where we need to understand things to the nth degree, an embedded system is typically a system that is dedicated in functions. It has to be reliable, it has to be predictable, it has a set number of things it does, and it has to be energy efficient. And because of those reasons, we as embedded designers have to tightly control the hardware and the software and what we do, and that's why the details under the hood really matter. An interesting historical fact is that around the year 2000, as processor manufacturers created faster and faster processors, the clock speed tended to peak somewhere in the 2 to 2.5 gigahertz range. In order to increase performance, to double the performance of a 2 gigahertz processor, jumping to 4 gigahertz was very, very difficult. At the same time, the industry found that most of the computer use was moving from a single tasking activity to a multitasking activity. So a new approach was needed to do more and faster in that environment. So around 2000, IBM came out with their Power 4 processor. It was the first what they called dual core processor. So rather than take that 2 gigahertz processor and try to hit 4 gigahertz, they put 2 processors running at I think there was a 1.2 gigahertz, but they put 2 processors effectively in the same piece of silicon. Now we can double the amount of processing we can do in that single chip. AMD followed fairly short after that. 2002, Intel followed with what they call a hyper-threading architecture. And hyper-threading is where a core can actually do two things using a superscalar architecture. So now a single core can do two things. Potentially a dual core could now do four things at once. About 10 years later, ARM came out with a technology, what they called big dot little. And it's actually little big and big little, where you had two different type of core processors. You had some cores that they called big cores. These are the big, high-performance, heavy-lifting cores that did much of the work and gave you that high-end performance. But they also had a bunch of what they called little cores. Virtually identical instruction set. They can do all the same things, but not quite as fast, with not quite the same amount of performance. But they were much, much more power efficient. Now I take a look at my phone. This is an iPhone 11. As of, I believe, the iPhone 7, every iPhone has, I think Apple has their A14, A15 Bionic chips. Those are using the ARM big dot little processor. The claim is that these little processors are much more efficient for silicon, and they're also much more power efficient. A couple of years ago, in 2020, Intel created what they called their hybrid core processor, which is effectively the same as the ARM big dot little. They created what they call performance cores, which used to be called the big, and they created efficiency cores, which are the little. So now we have a mix of high performance cores and high efficiency cores in a processor. The P cores, or performance cores, are meant for the heavy lifting, high performance activities, and the efficiency cores are available to do the things that don't have a time criticality to them. I don't like using the term time critical. It's more time important, because these are not what I would say are the critical avionics type of time criticality we have. And Intel's research around this showed them that most workloads do not scale beyond 4 cores. Most of what we all do, email, web browsing, spreadsheets, they do not scale much more than 4 cores. A small number of applications will scale up to about 8 cores. And then a very smaller subset of those applications can scale all the way up, as many cores as you have. And we know that from things like radar applications, which can scale if you have 20, 30, 40 cores, you can use all those cores. But this gave a lot of good research in terms of Intel in the consumer world, knowing there's efficiency cores and there's performance cores. How many cores really matter to the end user? So more cores, more threads, you'd think your computer would go faster. I like to draw the analogy with putting more cars on the road. And if you want to get more cars on the road, you need more lanes, well, the analogy being more cores. Maybe you put more cars on the road, maybe they're closer together, and you think you can get better performance. But the reality is there will always be bottlenecks. Traffic will slow down because there's on-ramps, there's off-ramps, there's shared resources. There may be, in this case here, this is a picture, I think there's a picture of one of the bridges in China. All the cars go into a single lane or a small number of lanes to get to the bridge. So there are bottlenecks in the hardware that we need to be aware of. If I have 20 cores, I'm not going to have 20 times the performance of a single core. And that's the reality that our software people must understand and utilize very effectively. When I was a youth, I was always in the pursuit of the next audio upgrade for the car. And I want to talk about marketing for a moment. And you can see in the picture here some speakers. And I'm sure there's a few audiophiles in the room here. How many speakers do you see? Anybody? 2 speakers. A few years ago, I bought a new car. It came with a 10-speaker enhanced Harman Kardon sound system. I thought 10 speakers, going to sound better. I went in the car and I started looking at the speakers, and I could only find 6, because in marketing, that is 4 speakers. They counted a coax speaker as 2, really upset me, but it still sounded okay. But details matter to the embedded designer, right? My previous laptop was a quad core. It didn't have hyper-threading, so it could do 4 things simultaneously, 4 concurrent threads. My new laptop, it's a 16-core Intel Alder Lake hybrid core processor, which means it has 16 physical cores. 8 of them are hyper-threading, so I can really do up to 24 things, 24 logical things at once. The reality is I'm not 4 or 6 times faster. But I do find the system much more responsive and more power efficient. And the reason for that is the operating system now knows there are performance cores, there are efficiency cores, and it knows what to put on those performance cores as I'm using the computer, and what of those background activities that don't really have that time criticality can make use of those efficiency cores in parallel, being more energy efficient and not taking time away from my performance cores. Performance details matter to the embedded designer because we need to have a predictable, repeatable, reliable system. So I'm going to ask you, since you all said you have laptops, Jerry said you're all leaving with new laptops at the end of this ETT. So which laptop would you prefer? That screaming fast 60 gigahertz one-core laptop, a 4-core laptop at 15 gigahertz, which is pretty fast, or a 20-core laptop at 3 gigahertz. Mathematically, they all provide 60 gigahertz cores of performance. But they will not give you the same performance when you actually use them. So performance does matter, and how you use the performance will have a great impact on software design, on hardware design, and on the systems we use today in embedded systems. What I like to focus customers on is what is the application that you're doing. If you're running a single tasking application, and many tasks are single tasking. If you go back to the 1800s, Charles Babbage, when he did the first analytical engine, right? His design for that analytical engine was it could do anything, but only one thing at a time. A really super fast 1-core 60 gigahertz processor would absolutely get you the answer faster. But real world algorithms, multitasking might be better. If you're running battlefield applications, standard, I'm going to say desktop type of applications, then a 4-core is probably good. If you're running radar and EASA type applications, EOIR, where multiple cores can be utilized to their fullest, if you have 20, 30, 40 cores and you can run all those cores in parallel, you will likely have better performance with more cores, even if they're at a lower clock speed, because you can do more things in parallel. So embedded designers now have to really consider what is the application, how can it utilize the cores, and if you can't utilize the cores, they're sitting there doing nothing. In the world of hybrid cores, if your main application can make use of those performance cores and let the operating system use those efficiency cores to do all of its background things, that's a very good mix. So in writing, I have a white paper on this. I looked at my desktop computer. It's a standard, corporate computer. It's got 16 cores, 24 threads. You can see highlighted in yellow, these are all the P cores, the performance cores, and in green are the efficiency cores. And you can see they're all running different things. What really shocked me was, and I'm not doing anything special here, I think I had maybe 3 or 4 applications open. 248 processes were running. Almost 4,000 threads of activity were being managed by that standard Windows desktop application. So there's a lot of stuff that happens under the hood that is not really your main application. And this is true whether it's Windows or Linux, which is the majority of our embedded systems. There's a lot of background activities that are running, whether it be watching for Ethernet traffic, checking your SSDs to do trimming operations. All these background things happen, and they can make use of these other threads, these efficiency threads, much more effectively. Intel has something called the thread director, and the thread director's job is to help the operating system pick and choose what type of processor core to use for any particular job. They've got foreground or background. Is it running on batteries? Are you running on AC? There's a bunch of different parameters you can use and let the operating system do the selection for you. That's the easy way. In an embedded world, we may want to control that to give us more predictability. Because if you're running an application and at one time it's running on an efficiency core, maybe at a lower clock speed, another time you're running at a performance core at a higher clock speed, you will get different performance. And if we want repeatability and predictability, especially if we start looking at anything that's potentially required for aerospace, which requires criticality, you need to understand what's happening under the hood. I do have a lot of data in the white paper. I'll show you the link to this. It's a really good read to understand what these processors are doing, starting with the Intel 12th generation in the consumer world, the Alder Lake, 13th generation of Raptor Lake. Hybrid core processing is here. It's now. It's in the public domain. And it will hit the embedded space. We have to be ready for this. We have to let our software people understand what they can do with using these cores effectively. They can direct tasks to different cores if they want to have full control. What we found when we did a bunch of performance analysis is hyper-threading cores give you a little bit less than 2 times the performance of a single core. That's because there's a little bit of shared cache memory and shared resources. Multiple independent cores also give you a little bit less than n times because, again, there's some shared resources. What I was really happy to see is that these efficiency cores gave me about 70% of the performance of my performance cores, but at half the power, which is significant, especially if you're looking at something that has 8, 10, 12, 14 cores of operation. So they give you a much better power efficiency. And the benefits of hybrid processors you use every day right now. Your phone lasts all day. Your laptop lasts longer, and you don't have that battery anxiety when you're on a long flight. In the consumer world, Intel is continuing to push hybrid processors. They do have roadmaps that have all performance cores. They have roadmaps with chips that have all efficiency cores. In fact, there are some processors in the roadmap that have hundreds of E cores and no performance cores, because power efficiency, especially if it's a data center running tens of thousands of processors, power efficiency matters. In our embedded systems, we can make use of these same technologies. We can save power, do things more responsibly, more effectively, more control over what our processors are doing. We can run longer. For example, maybe we run, if it's a UAV or something that's running on electric power, maybe it runs only on the efficiency cores while it gets to the theater of operation. Kind of a background mode, saving power, and then you turn on the performance cores. A lot of techniques can be used to make use of these hybrid core processors. It's a 2-part white paper. The links are here, but if you want to just remember where it is, if you go to the Curtiss-Wright website and search for cores and threads, you'll be able to get the details. The first part talks a little bit about what I've explained today. The second part of this white paper goes into the gory details of all the performance aspects that we've measured here today. They're here, they're now, and you're going to see a lot of those over the next year to 2 years. Thank you.